Jurisdiction: Texas, United States. She didn't even buy me a cup of coffee before pushing the medical consent forms across the diner table, telling me it was time to finally do my duty for the family. I didn't cry, and I didn't remind her she had forfeited the right to call us family 2 decades ago. I just picked up the pen, examined the fine print, and smiled. Less than a week later, her pristine, carefully curated suburban life shattered into a million irreparable pieces, and they never saw it coming. My mother, Evelyn, possesses a terrifying kind of amnesia. It's not medical. It's selective. She only remembers the version of reality where she is the long-suffering saint, the victim of circumstance, the martyr holding the world together. The reality where she packed her designer bags when I was 12, moved into a luxury high-rise condo with a man named Richard, and left me to be raised by a father whose heart was quietly giving out, simply does not exist in her mind. Richard was loud, heavily colonned, and fundamentally hollow. He was a man who spoke entirely in the language of investments, leverage, and returns, yet never seemed to actually hold a steady, discernible job. To Evelyn, he was an upgrade. I was a downgrade. A 12-year-old girl is messy, she requires attention, and she asks uncomfortable questions. Richard only required a willing audience. So she chose the audience. I grew up watching her from a distance, like a satellite orbiting a planet that had violently expelled it. My father did his best. He worked overtime, he made the school lunches, he sat through the painfully quiet parent-teacher conferences with a stoic smile. But the absence of a mother leaves a very specific kind of vacuum in a home. It warps the acoustics. Every silence feels like a judgment. When I was 18, my father passed away from a sudden, massive heart attack. In his will, he left behind a modest trust fund exactly $250,000, designated to cover my college tuition and give me a clean start in life. Because of a minor legal technicality regarding executor status in the state of Texas, my mother, wielding a weaponized display of grief and a highly paid probate attorney, contest, had the custodianship. She argued I was too emotionally unstable to manage the impending inheritance, submitting my declining high school grades caused entirely by watching my father die if proof. The judge bought the performance. She temporarily gained administrative oversight of the estate until my 21st birthday. I didn't fight it. I was drowning in grief, and I thought, naively, that even she wouldn't cross a boundary that's sacred. I was wrong. Over the next 36 months, she systematically dismantled my future. Richard needed capital for a luxury car import business. The first withdrawal was $50,000 labeled in the ledger as a high-yield short-term loan. Then came the remodeling of their condo. Then the country club dues. By the time I turned 21 and the legal control transferred to me, I sat in a cold bank manager's office staring at a monitor that read $412.16. My blood ran cold. The bank manager couldn't even meet my eyes. He just silently handed me the printouts, the undeniable paper trail of my mother choosing her new husband's vanity over my survival. When I confronted her later that evening, she didn't flinch. She just adjusted her silk scarf, let out a short, humorless laugh, and said, "We needed it, Maya. Family helps family. You're being dramatic." I didn't cry. I took action. I packed my bags, changed my phone number, and spent the next decade building my life from the ground up, brick by agonizing brick. I put myself through school working night shifts. I became a forensic accountant, a profession born entirely from a subconscious, desperate need to track exactly where things go wrong, to follow the money, to prove that numbers do. Not lie even when the people you love do. For 10 years, my life was beautifully, perfectly quiet. I built a career, a home, and an existence entirely insulated from their chaos. Then, last Tuesday, my phone rang. It was an unrecognized number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Maya, her voice drifted through the speaker, carrying that familiar, cloying sweetness that always preceded a demand. Richard is sick. We need you. Not hello. Not I miss you. Just we need you. Richard, it turned out, had spent the last 2 decades drinking his way through a liver and 2 kidneys. His body was failing. The wait list for a deceased donor in our region was 5 years long, and his doctors had made it clear he didn't have 5 years. Evelyn had tracked me down because I was young, healthy, and, in her twisted logic, owed them a debt of existence. We met at a diner off the interstate. She looked older, the edges of her manicured life fraying just slightly under the fluorescent lights. She ordered a black coffee, didn't offer to pay for mine, and slid a glossy brochure for a living donor evaluation program across the Formica table. "It's just a simple procedure," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "And it would mean so much to Richard. He's family, Maya. Family steps up." I looked at her. I saw the desperate, clawing entitlement of a woman who believed the world existed solely to cushion her falls. If you are listening to this and something feels heavy and familiar in your chest, I need you to hear me clearly. What you are experiencing is the insidious machinery of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic. Narcissistic family systems use your empathy as a weapon against you. They train you to confuse guilt with shame. Guilt is feeling bad for a specific mistake you made. Shame is feeling bad for who you fundamentally are. They want you submerged in shame, so you will perform the acts of duty they demand without question. They call it keeping the peace, but keeping the peace with a toxic system is just a polite name for slow self-destruction. Stop letting them define loyalty. The exit is right in front of you. Write down one boundary tonight, just one, and enforce it tomorrow, even if your voice shakes. I sat in that diner, listening to the hum of the refrigerator unit, feeling the weight of the clinic brochure under my fingertips. I told her I would think about it. I told her I would review the medical history she had brought. What I'm about to tell you is the part I almost left out, but you need to hear it. Because what I found when I ran his name through my firm's private database didn't just disqualify me from the surgery. It connected Richard to a devastating financial secret that changed everything I thought I knew about the past 20 years. That was the setup. Now here's where I stopped being patient and started being precise. I took the glossy clinic brochure and the thin manila folder of Richard's medical records back to my apartment. I poured a glass of ice water and sat at my kitchen island. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things. My hands were perfectly steady. I opened the folder. Evelyn had included his basic intake forms to prove his condition, hoping the clinical descriptions of his failing liver and kidneys would evoke some latent daughterly pity. Instead, my eyes caught a sequence of 9 digits on the second page. A secondary billing employer identification number listed under a guarantor section. In forensic accounting, an EIN is a thread hanging from a sweater. You pull it and eventually, the whole garment unravels. I logged into my firm's secure database. The connection was unusually slow that night, buffering for nearly 20 minutes while I drummed my fingers on the granite countertop. When the page finally loaded, I started pulling the thread. The EIN belonged to a holding company called R&E Apex Solutions LLC, registered in Delaware, managed by a registered agent. But the property tax records linked to that LLC were public. They owned a commercial warehouse district just outside of Austin. I pulled the acquisition date, October 2015. Exactly 3 weeks after the final $50,000 withdrawal from my father's trust fund. They hadn't squandered my inheritance on a failed luxury car import business. They had used my father's death as seed capital. They laundered a grieving teenager's college fund through a dummy corporation, bought commercial real estate, and sat back while the Austin market exploded. I ran the current valuation of the LLC's assets. $850,000 in liquid capital and property equity. The air in my kitchen felt incredibly thin. I kept my voice steady as I read the numbers aloud to the empty room, just to make sure they were real. $850,000. Richard wasn't asking for my kidney because he had no other options. With that kind of capital, they could have afforded the absolute best private care. They could have hired a team of elite specialists. They could have funded his treatments out of pocket without blinking. But that would require liquidating their precious assets. That would cost their money. Getting a free organ from the daughter they discarded was simply more cost-effective. Evelyn wasn't asking me to save a life out of love. She was asking me to subsidize their retirement portfolio with my literal flesh. They had priced my body parts and decided a warehouse in Austin was worth more. I didn't know it then, but that Tuesday was the last day I would ever feel an ounce of obligation toward that woman. This is where people get financial abuse wrong. If you are listening to this and you suspect someone in your family is hiding assets, understand that the truth is never found in their tears or their dramatic speeches. The truth is in the paper trail. Financial abuse is still abuse, and arrogant people always leave evidence because they fundamentally believe they will never be audited by the people they consider beneath them. A document signed, a tax ID filed, a property deed recorded. These are facts, not feelings. Build your paper trail quietly before you ever confront them. Do not ask for the truth. Hunt for the receipts. I closed the database. The emotional temperature in my body dropped to absolute zero. I stopped feeling and I started calculating. Evelyn wanted me to be family again? Fine. I would give her exactly what she asked for. I would step up. The next morning, I drove to the transplant clinic. The waiting room was sterile, smelling faintly of bleach and stale coffee. The appointment ran late. I sat in that plastic chair for 40 minutes, my foot tapping a slow, methodical rhythm against the linoleum. When I finally met with the coordinator, I played the part perfectly. I asked concerned questions. I filled out the preliminary HIPAA release forms, ensuring that I had the legal right to request comprehensive medical histories to rule out genetic anomalies. Then I texted Evelyn. I told her the clinic needed everything: full medical records, past procedures, advanced directives, financial guarantees for post-operative care. It's standard protocol, I texted. They need to know the recipient is financially stable enough to maintain the anti-rejection meds. She fed X'd a massive box of documents overnight. She was so blinded by her own victory, so smug in her belief that she had successfully guilted me into compliance, that she simply handed her entire life over to a forensic accountant. Inside that box was a gem I hadn't even dared to hope for. It wasn't just medical records. It was Richard's entire estate plan, accidentally mixed in with his hospital discharge papers. I read the documents twice, the legal jargon stark and undeniable. Richard's paranoia was his fatal flaw. He had explicitly named Evelyn as his primary medical proxy, yes, but in a buried, aggressively worded subclause regarding asset liquidation. He had locked her out completely. The LLC and the trust were entirely in his name alone. If Richard became incapacitated or died, Evelyn had zero legal authority to touch the $850,000. In fact, a prenuptial agreement stipulated that upon his death, the assets transferred to his biological brother. Evelyn didn't just want my kidney to save her husband. She needed my kidney to keep her meal ticket alive, because without him, she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. She had sold me out for a man who didn't even care enough to leave her the condo they lived in. I let out a short, humorless laugh. The irony was so sharp it left a metallic taste in my mouth. I spent Friday night printing. The rhythmic hum of my laser printer was the only sound in my apartment. I printed the original trust documents for my father. I printed the withdrawal slips bearing her signature. I printed the Delaware LLC formation documents and the property deeds. I built a timeline of betrayal, documented in black ink and legally binding signatures. It was 50 pages of undeniable proof. I compiled them into a sleek, black leather binder. Every page tabbed, highlighted, and indexed with surgical precision. I called Evelyn on a Thursday morning. The clinic called, I said, injecting just the right amount of nervous hesitation. The preliminary results are in. We need to have a family meeting. Just you, me, and Richard. At your place. Oh, Mia, she cooed, the sound dripping with manufactured maternal warmth. I knew you'd do the right thing. Come over on Sunday. I'll make a roast. She thought she was setting the table for a celebration. What I was bringing inside that black binder would ensure she never ate comfortably in that dining room again. What I've told you so far is how they broke me down. What comes next is how I built back differently. Sunday evening in Austin was suffocatingly humid. The elevator in their luxury high-rise was unexpectedly out of service. I had to walk up 4 flights of stairs holding a heavy leather binder. My palms sweat slightly against the spine, a small crack in my armor. I thought I was ready for that moment. I wasn't, not entirely. But the hesitation vanished the second Evelyn opened the door. The condo smelled of rosemary roast and expensive Pinot Noir. Richard sat in a plush leather recliner, looking jaundiced, but undeniably arrogant. I walked in, declining her offer to take my coat. I stood by the glass dining table, my posture rigid. The pre-confrontation clock stopped. Evelyn smiled, a practiced expression of maternal relief. The clinic coordinator told us the blood work is perfect, Maya. We told Richard's surgeon to schedule the procedure for next month. It's a blessing. We knew you wouldn't let your family down when it really mattered. I kept my voice steady. I didn't look at Richard. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I am not giving him a kidney, Evelyn. I unzipped my leather tote. I pulled out the black binder. I dropped it flat onto the center of the glass dining table. It hit the surface with a heavy, devastating thud. Evelyn didn't scream. She just sat there, very still, the audacity momentarily short-circuiting in her brain. She blinked slowly, staring at the cover sheet. A vein began to pulse violently at her temple as her eyes scanned the text, R&E Apex Solutions LLC. Asset valuation, $850,000. She reached out with a trembling hand, her nails catching on the plastic tabs as she flipped to the bank transfer records bearing her own forged signatures. The color completely drained from her face. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his recliner. His raspy, labored breathing suddenly hitched in his chest and his hands gripped the armrests until his knuckles turned pale. The room went dead silent, the only sound the low, mechanical hum of the central air conditioning. "You can buy a kidney. You can't have mine." Evelyn stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Maya, you don't understand. That money is tied up. It's for our retirement. If we liquidate the warehouse, we'll lose everything we've built. The taxes alone would be catastrophic. We'll be completely ruined." I let the silence hang. I wanted her to hear the sheer absurdity of her own words echoing off the vaulted ceilings. She was asking me to undergo major surgery, risk my health, and give away an organ, all so she wouldn't have to sell a commercial property purchased with my stolen inheritance. "Turn to tab 4, I instructed, my voice cold and surgical. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the paper. "Turn to tab 4, Evelyn." She flipped the pages. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched her pupils dilate in real-time panic. "That is Richard's revised estate plan," I explained, leaning slightly over the table. "Dated 3 years ago. Notice the exclusionary clause on page 7. If Richard dies, the LLC and the trust do not default to you as his surviving spouse. He signed a secondary directive bypassing your marital assets. Upon his death, every single penny, every brick of that warehouse, transfers directly to his brother in Chicago." Evelyn's head snapped up. She looked at Richard. Richard looked away, staring fixedly at the Austin skyline out the window, refusing to meet her gaze. "He locked you out, Mother," I said, my tone devoid of pity. "You stole my college fund to build his empire, and he cut you out of the will. You don't want my kidney to save your husband. You want my kidney to keep your meal ticket breathing. Because the second his heart stops, you are legally entitled to nothing. You will be evicted from this condo within 30 days. The facade shattered completely. The elegant martyr vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. She turned on Richard, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She demanded to know if the documents were true. Richard muttered something defensive about protecting his hard-earned assets from her reckless spending. In 30 seconds, the united front of family completely collapsed, dissolving into vicious infighting. I stood there and watched the empire burn. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt dangerously clear. Boundaries are simply a precise description of what you will and will not accept in your life. Enforcing them is not cruelty, it is clarity. When you finally say no to a narcissistic system, they will accuse you of destroying the family. But you cannot destroy something that was only ever held together by your silent suffering. People who scream the loudest about loyalty have almost always done the least to earn it. Leaving them to face the consequences of their own actions quietly and legally is the most powerful thing you can do. I watched them argue for another 2 minutes. Richard clutching his failing side, Evelyn screaming about her decades of sacrifices. Neither of them even looked at me anymore. I was no longer a daughter or a donor. I was just the catalyst for their mutual destruction. I calmly closed my tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. I didn't need the binder anymore. The poison was already in the water. I turned around and walked toward the heavy oak door. I placed my hand on the cold brass handle. "Maya, wait!" Evelyn suddenly shrieked, her footsteps frantic against the hardwood floor. She grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my jacket sleeve. "You can't just leave. If he dies, I have nothing. I'm your mother. You have to help me fix this." I looked down at her hand. Then I looked at her face, tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks. What happened next, the final lever I pulled before I walked out that door, was the one thing she never expected, and the very thing that guaranteed she would never, ever contact me again. Walking out of that room felt like victory. But the next 72 hours taught me what victory actually costs. I pulled my arm free from Evelyn's grasp, deliberately and without rushing. I didn't shake her off. I simply removed her hand as if peeling a dying vine from a brick wall. Reaching into my tote bag one last time, I retrieved a single, thick cardstock business card and pressed it flat into her trembling palm. It wasn't the card of a nephrologist, or a family counselor, or a transplant coordinator. It was the direct contact information for one of the most ruthless, high-net-worth divorce and asset recovery attorneys in the state of Texas. "You have exactly however long his kidneys hold out to secure your living situation," I told her, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because the second he goes into hospice, his brother is going to freeze the accounts. Good luck, Evelyn." I didn't wait for her to respond. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing the mausoleum they had built for themselves. The drive back to my apartment was entirely silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I just watched the highway lines blur into the darkness, feeling a strange, hollow lightness expand in my chest where the anxiety used to live. If you are listening to this and something feels terrifyingly familiar about that moment of walking away, we need to talk about trauma bonding and the weaponization of guilt. A trauma bond isn't just missing someone who hurt you. It's a profound biological addiction to a cycle of abuse. Narcissistic family systems train your brain to confuse guilt with shame. Guilt is feeling bad for a specific action you took, like refusing a medical procedure. Shame is feeling bad for who you fundamentally are, like believing you are a defective daughter for prioritizing your own survival. They want you submerged in shame, so you will stay and perform the acts of servitude they demand. You think you are staying out of loyalty, but you are actually trapped in a dopamine-driven survival loop, starving for a single breadcrumb of their approval. The agonizing guilt you feel when you finally leave isn't proof that you made a mistake. It's simply the addiction fighting to survive. No contact is not a dramatic tantrum or a punishment. It is a strict, non-negotiable medical decision necessary to detox your nervous system. The exit strategy is simple, but brutal. Write down the factual difference between what you actually did and what they are accusing you of. Block their access to you completely, and treat the silence like a prescription. You have to outlast the withdrawal. 3 weeks passed. Then everything accelerated. Richard's condition deteriorated much faster than his smug doctors had originally projected. Without a viable living donor lined up, he was forced onto emergency hemodialysis. The physical toll on his failing body was severe, but the financial toll on their lifestyle was absolute carnage. Because Richard had hoarded the LLC's capital to avoid massive liquidation taxes, his liquid personal checking accounts began to hemorrhage money to cover the out-of-network dialysis, his treatments, and the round-the-clock home nursing care that Evelyn absolutely refused to provide herself. Evelyn, panicked and desperate as the walls closed in, attempted a final, legally disastrous maneuver. She tried to use her medical power of attorney to unilaterally transfer the title of the Austin warehouse out of the LLC and directly into her personal name. She forged Richard's signature on the transfer deed, utilizing the exact same sloppy, arrogant technique she had used to drain my trust fund a decade earlier. But she made one critical, unforgivable error. She forgot about the brother in Chicago. I hadn't forgotten him. The morning after the confrontation at the condo, I had taken the liberty of overnighting a duplicate copy of the black binder to Richard's brother. I included a very brief, coldly polite cover letter explaining that Evelyn had a documented, irrefutable history of financial fraud, complete with the bank records proving she had previously embezzled a trust fund using forged signatures. The brother, a man who shared Richard's ruthless financial acumen, but possessed none of his reckless sentimentality, did not hesitate. He didn't call Evelyn to negotiate. He didn't ask for her side of the story. Armed with my forensic paper trail, his legal team filed an emergency ex parte injunction in a Texas civil court. They completely froze the LLC. They froze Richard's remaining personal assets, citing Evelyn's attempted fraudulent property transfer and Richard's rapidly diminishing mental capacity due to uremic encephalopathy. Why? Evelyn was locked out of her own life. Her platinum credit cards linked to the business accounts were systematically declined at the grocery store, the pharmacy, and the salon. Her country club membership lapsed due to non-payment. The luxury imported SUV was repossessed from the condo's secure parking garage on a Tuesday morning, right in front of the building concierge and two of her closest socialite friends. DS. She tried to call me, of course. She left 14 increasingly frantic voicemails in a span of just 3 days. The first few were raging, venomous threats of lawsuits and retaliation. By the 7th voicemail, the anger had fractured into pure panic. The bank had officially locked the primary checking account. By the 14th, she was weeping hysterically, invoking the memory of my dead father, begging for a short-term loan just to keep the electricity on in the condo. I listened to every single one of them while drinking my morning coffee. I didn't delete them, but I didn't reply either. I filed them away in a secure digital folder. They were no longer threats. They were simply the dying echoes of an empire that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own rot. I thought the paper trail was closed. I thought she had finally hit rock bottom. But a cornered narcissist always has one last card to play. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a client's portfolio when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. My phone buzzed with an urgent email notification from the county clerk's automated public records system. The connection kept buffering, the little circle spinning relentlessly on my screen. I only caught fragments of the subject line at first, but I saw enough. What I found attached to that email didn't just confirm her total financial ruin. It revealed one final, desperate crime she had committed in my name, a crime that meant the police were already on their way to her door. The county clerk's alert was actually a cross-reference notification from a major credit bureau. When the brother from Chicago successfully froze Richard's accounts, Evelyn found herself completely destitute overnight. She didn't look for a job. She didn't seek honest help. She looked for a scapegoat. She had attempted to open a massive, unsecured personal line of credit for $75,000 through an online lending institution. But she didn't use her own name because her credit was completely tied to Richard's now frozen empire. She used my social security number, the one piece of data she had retained from my childhood medical files. She thought it would take me months to notice. She thought she could take the cash, hire a vicious defense attorney to fight the brother's injunction, unfreeze the LLC, and somehow salvage her luxurious life before the first buy-ling cycle ever hit my mailbox. She fundamentally believed that my identity, just like my college fund, was hers to use whenever her bad choices caught up with her. But she forgot exactly who she was dealing with. I am a forensic accountant. My personal credit is locked down under maximum security freezes and dual-factor fraud alerts. The loan application didn't just fail, it triggered an automatic, high-priority alert to the state's Financial Crimes Division. In the state of Texas, fraudulent use of identifying information to obtain $50,000 or more is a second-degree felony. It carries a penalty of 2 to 20 years in state prison. And because I had already established a documented history of her financial fraud with the brother's legal team, the authorities didn't treat it as a family misunderstanding. They treated it as an escalating criminal pattern of a desperate woman. I didn't call her to gloat. I didn't drive over to the condo to watch the spectacle. I simply forwarded the automated credit alert to the detective who had contacted me to verify my identity. I calmly confirmed that I had not authorized the loan. I provided the previous trust fund theft documentation to establish her modus operandi, and I stated clearly, on the record, that I would press full criminal charges. I saw the resolution exactly 4 days later, not in person, but as a brief, humiliating clip on the local evening news broadcast. The cameras caught her being escorted out of the luxury high-rise lobby by 2 uniformed officers, her wrists handcuffed tightly in front of her. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled. Her perfectly highlighted hair was undone and flat. She wasn't screaming or fighting the way she had in the condo. She just looked incredibly small and entirely vacant. The pristine, untouchable reality she had curated for 20 years had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard facts of her own greed. Richard didn't even seem to notice she was gone. With his medical power of attorney officially revoked by the court due to Evelyn's fraud, his brother's legal team took full control. They transferred Richard to a modest, state-funded hospice facility closer to Chicago later that week. The Austin warehouse was legally liquidated, and the funds were secured safely in an ironclad trust that Evelyn would never ever be able to access. She had traded her daughter for a man's wealth, and in the end, she lost the man, the wealth, and her freedom in one fell swoop. The luxury condo went into foreclosure within 60 days. Evelyn's high-priced defense attorney dropped her the moment her retainer check bounced. She was assigned a deeply overworked public defender and was denied bail due to the flight risk associated with the severe financial fraud charges. She will spend the next several years in a state facility, wearing a uniform she can't accessorize, entirely forgotten by the society friends she sacrificed me to impress. I never saw her again. I never visited the jail, and I never answered the collect calls. The paper trail that began with a stolen college fund ended in a cardboard box of evidence in a county courthouse. It was closed, perfectly balanced, and finalized. Walking away from this, people often ask me how I managed to stay so calm while tearing down my own mother's life. But what I know now that I didn't know before this happened is that I didn't tear anything down. I just handed her the bill for what she had already broken. When you grow up in a toxic system, you were taught that silence is the price of admission for love. You are conditioned to believe that holding people accountable is an act of violence. It isn't. The most profound realization of my life is that you do not have to carry the consequences of someone else's dysfunction just because you share their DNA. Healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes, healing looks like a flawlessly executed spreadsheet. It looks like refusing to be the collateral damage in someone else's delusion. I built a beautiful, quiet life out of the ashes she left me, and protecting that peace is my only obligation. So if you're standing in the ashes right now, wondering if you have the right to walk away, I'm telling you, you do. What will you build when you stop paying their debts? So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.